If you've been here before, you know about lines. The letters of this dusty acronym stand for list, include, modify, exclude, and spin. And they can help you analyze your inspiration and then change it up so you can make it your own. Of course, you have to start with some inspiration. And today, I'm excited to be introducing you to one of my newest crafty friends, Brennan. I'll link to him at the end of this video and also put a link in the description below. He's a talented newcomer on the card making scene and also to YouTube, so I'm excited to introduce you all to him and to show you how 3 of his cards help me squeeze even more out of lines. Let's start with this adorable Christmas card. When I analyze an inspiration, I start by listing all the attributes of it. I break it down into 3 categories. I start with colors. We've got blue, white, red, and green. Then I look at techniques. Brennan has stamped and colored these gnomes. Finally, I look at elements. Those big stripes in the background were really what caught my eye when I was scrolling through his Instagram feed. There are 3 Christmas gnomes evenly spaced, there's lots of white space, and he's got a landscape orientation. I started with the stripes. I think Brennan's used some pattern paper, but I pulled out my Dainty Plaid stencil. These are designed to be blended then flipped to get that crisscross pattern, so by using it in just one direction, I'll get diagonal stripes. There are 3 layers to this stencil set, and if you use all 3, the whole page will be covered, so I'll leave one out to maintain some white space. I'm using 2 of the new gray inks from Catherine Pooler Designs and my sticky mat in my Altenew stamp wheel. I think you can see each time I put the stencil down over the cardstock panel how well it's gripping that photopolymer. I don't even need to use my other hand to hold anything in place. And to remove the panel, just bend the mat away from the cardstock. Remember, it's pretty grippy, and I have had a couple of instances where I ripped the cardstock by being too impatient. But by doing it this way and taking my time, it means I got no rips and pretty much no warping either. I'm going to use some flowers instead of the gnomes, and I've got this fabulous flower die set that cuts a solid flower as well as a matching outline, and being able to use each separately or combine them gives you a lot of possible looks. First, I'm going to add some color to the solid flowers. I put the die cuts down on that sticky mat, making sure they were far enough apart so I won't have any trouble with mixing my colors. I've looked at the gnomes and one is blue, one is red, and one is green. So I'm going to do blue, dark pink, and green. The centers of these flowers are pretty small, so the petals can be quite floppy, and I find it so much easier to have them stuck down on something like this mat, so they don't shift or rip while I'm blending the ink on top. I went in heavy in the center and I let it fade out toward the edges. Then to add some texture, I splattered some water over top. These inks react with water, especially when you lift it off with a paper towel or a cloth. As I went to glue the outline onto them, I realized that you can do it a couple of ways. You can line up the outline right over the petals, or you can kind of offset them. So I tested the 2 looks out before I committed, and at the end I really liked the definition the outline gave to the petals when they were lined up right over top. But you could even get another look by offsetting 2 outlines, so there's still lots of possibilities with these dies. I set these aside to dry and I got out my Misty to stamp a sentiment. Brennan's card didn't have a sentiment. His Christmassy images made it pretty clear what the occasion was, but we're in grad season right now and I have a few cards to make. I lined up some of the outlines so I could get a sense of where the flowers will be, and then I used some black ink in a waffle flower sentiment. This font is a little bit chunky, so it doesn't need a sentiment strip or a shadow around it. It can stand on its own on this gray background. Next, I wanted to add some sparkly flower centers. I've got the 3 flowers on a loop of tape on an acrylic block. I just did this so I could move them out of the way to dry in a safe place when I'm done. As I said, the flower centers are really small, so I grabbed this die. It is so old, I have no idea where it came from, but I do find it to be a great basic to have on hand. I can cut a number of dots all at once, and these are great to use as embellishments or even as little swatches on the sides of ink pads or tops of blending brushes. Anyway, I glued a dot in the center of each flower with my liquid glue, and already that's changed the look of these flowers. I added some Nouveau Crystal glaze to each flower center, and then I sprinkled some chunky iridescent glitter onto each one. The glaze looks a little cloudy or yellowish or something right now, but as it dries, it'll go clear and the glitter will give a beautiful sparkle. To assemble the card, I used some foam tape on the back of my stripe panel. I like to measure the first strip along the card and then use that strip to cut the rest of them to be the correct length. And yes, I like very full coverage of foam tape behind my panels. If you're comfortable with less, then do that, but I find this gives a really sturdy feeling card. This is 1-inch foam tape, so I get the coverage pretty quickly, but I can always cut the strips thinner if I need to. Now that my flowers are completely dry, I can attach them to the card. I get them in the same order as the gnomes, but then I had to see whether I wanted them all with the center petals up and down or across. I hope you can see what I mean by that, because it's kind of hard to explain. To attach them, I use these very tiny foam dots that I have in my stash, and I put them directly on the small flower centers. And here's a couple of tips for centering a row of items like this. First, put the center one down first. And second, use your work surface to help. You may not have noticed, but that thick line on my mat is the center of the card. So I know if I have those 2 petals along that line, the flower will be centered properly. Then it's just a matter of placing the other 2 flowers on each side, making sure the tops and bottoms line up so that the row is straight. I'll try to give you a close-up of the sparkle of the flower centers, but I'm not sure how well the camera is picking it up. Okay, let's see how I did. First, I included diagonal stripes, 3 focal images in the blue, red, and green families. I modified the gnomes to flowers, the pattern paper stripes to a stencil technique, and the colors of the stripes, although they're still pretty neutral, and the occasion. I excluded any coloring or fussy cutting. And for my spin, which is really just about adding a signature touch or ideas that weren't part of the inspiration, I made the card a 4 1/4 inch square, and I added a sentiment and some sparkle. My next inspiration is this Sunny Hello card. It's got yellow, orange, red, white, and green. It's got stamping, and I think the flower is colored with layered stamps. It's got a radiating geometric background, and you know I love those, with a white center and a simple stamped sentiment. I'm going to reverse the colors with a blended background, and I decided to try using my Altenew sticky mat as a gel press after I remove it from the base. That'll make it easier. I've got 4 summery colors, and I pressed each one down onto the mat, and I was amazed by the vibrancy. I find on a gel press the dye inks can kind of dissipate a bit and lose some of that bold color and need more layers to really build it up, but this is pretty amazing. I overlap the inks a bit, but you don't have to. By brayering over the inks and moving the brayer just slightly up and down, you'll get a really smooth blend. I have this 6-inch brayer, which makes it really easy to blend large areas like this, but a smaller one would work, possibly with some cleaning. Then I just put the cardstock down, press it all over, and peel it up. Honestly, is this the answer to perfect ink blending? I'll have to think about that. I did another layer, but I'm not even sure I needed to. And then I even got another panel by using the ink left on the brayer and on the sticky mat. It's not quite as saturated, but it still looks pretty good. Sticky mat as a gel press gets my approval for sure. I spritzed some water over top of the darker panel for some added texture, and then trimmed it with a square die. I brought my radiating rectangles from the background to the front by using this waffle flower die cut, and I cut one of the fab flowers from that paler panel. In fact, I thought it was too pale, so I gave it another coat of yellow ink just to brighten it up a bit. This die cut gives me the white circle in the center too, the perfect place for my stamped sentiment. And I used my Misty in the flower to help me position another congrats sentiment from that same waffle flower stamp set, and I stamped it with black ink. To assemble the card, I cut 3 circles slightly smaller than the die cut center from some of my white scraps. Using scraps of cardstock like this is a really great way to add dimension, and you can customize it by using more or fewer layers. Again, I played around with how to put the outline die cut over the solid flower, and I almost left it offset, but then I quickly changed it. It felt a little fussy, plus it was almost interfering with the sentiment. And then I considered leaving off the green altogether, but I wanted to add some sparkle, and I remembered that I have these new dewdrops from Crafty Meraki. They're round and smooth, and instead of sparkling, they seem to glow. There's lots of colors available, and in each pack there's lots of sizes, so I put the biggest one I could find in the center of the flower, and then I added some more around the sentiment. Let's evaluate. I included the colors, the radiating element, a flower, and a stamped sentiment. I modified the proportion and locations of the colors. I moved the flower, changed the look of the flower as well as the technique, and I moved the location of the sentiment. I excluded the leaves, and for my spin, again I used a square card, and this time those green dewdrops. My final inspiration is another pretty floral, this time in rich blues, teals, and pinks with a pop of yellow. Brennan has used some stripy swinking, so he's obviously already come across Laurel, the person who made the word swinking, trying to say ink swiping. and he's colored and die cut his main image. He's got a stitched oval die cut behind his flowers, a stamped sentiment in the bottom right corner, a black frame, and 5 pearl embellishments. I decided to put all my colors on my background stripes and leave my flowers white, so another change in proportion and location of the colors. I've got this pinstripe background stamp from Hurley. It's a pull-apart, so I'm only using one portion. I'm using my big Sizzix stamp positioner, which has a huge lid that may knock into my camera. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to use that feature where you can move the door to move the stamp and get perfectly spaced images. I positioned the stamp near the bottom of my panel, and then I started inking it up with my yellow ink. I cleaned the stamp, picked up the door to the tool, and moved it up one notch. There's a space in between, so I'm skipping the pink and moving right onto the greeny blue. Then cleaning, moving the door, and skipping to the dark blue. Next, I cleaned the stamp and I repositioned it between the 2 stripes already there. I inked it with some pink ink, and then I moved the door and inked it with another greeny blue. I continued on until I had what I thought was enough coverage. I want to cut this down into a circle. Removing a panel from this sticky grid is not difficult, but it does take a bit of time, and I find that it leaves a sticky residue on the back of the panel, which I don't love. I've cut the panel down with a circle die now, and it's just making me happy already. The colors and shape make me think of a beach ball. Here's the white flowers, and I think I'll make the outlines black this time, similar to Brennan's stamped outlines and also the black frame on his card. And to add a little more black, I use this stitching circle die, and then I'll put black behind so the holes really show up. I cut the same size circle from black cardstock, and then I cut a circle from the center so I don't have to use so much black cardstock that no one will see. I taped the die in place, and when I was removing the tape, I actually damaged my panel a little bit, even though I was trying so hard to be patient. I do find that these tapes stick more than I think they should, especially when I'm running them through a die cutting machine. But it's hardly noticeable, and hey, I've got some flowers I can use to cover it up. I quickly poked out all the little holes, and they stuck to that sticky back of the panel, but eventually I got them all done. Next, it was time to stamp the sentiment. I went back to that first congrats sentiment because it's chunky and it can be easily read, even on the striped background. To glue the striped panel to the black frame, I put tiny dots of glue between every other hole, just tiny bits so they wouldn't squish out. To add dimension to this panel, I used some foam squares just on the inside of the black frame. Remember, that frame does add a bit of dimension itself, so if I put tape across the whole back, I might end up with some lumps. Before I attached the flowers, I did the same thing as I did for the first card, with the dots and the glaze and the glitter, but this time my dots are black and that glitter looks amazing on black. Once they were dry, I glued them directly to the card with liquid glue. Okay, let's see. I used Brennan's colors, although I lightened the pink and deepened the blue. I used some stripes, I've got some florals, and a stitch detail. I modified the oval to a circle. I put the colors all on that while leaving the flowers white. My black frame is on the flowers themselves, and I moved this sentiment onto my striped shape. I excluded the pearls, although I did create my own embellishments, so maybe that's more of a modify. And I didn't swink. And for spin, I made a square card. So you'll notice that as I went from the first to the third inspiration, my cards became less and less like Brennan's. And that's okay. There's no lines police. It's okay if you end up making a card really similar or even identical to your inspiration. And it's equally okay if your result is really far away from the inspiration. Inspiration's meant to help you get your own creativity flowing, and lines is meant to be a method for getting the most out of your creativity, and never to restrict you in any way. If this is your first time seeing lines in action, or if you just need a little reminder, don't forget I've got a free worksheet for you that you can download and print and use whenever you're inspired. The link's below in the description. Now it's time to head to Brennan's channel to see how he was inspired by some of my work. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.